This is Social Europe Podcast. We are dedicated to strengthening democracy by discussing the most pressing political, economic, and social issues of our time. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Almut Möller, thank you very much indeed for joining me on Social Europe Podcast on the critical issues of European foreign and security policy in a, I think you can say without hesitation, in a changing context as we move into 2025. So just to get us going, the concept of strategic autonomy has been put forward in the European Union. How do you assess strategic autonomy in the context of this new environment? And what does it actually mean to achieve strategic autonomy in this context?
Well, thank you very much, Henning, for having me. It's great to be on the podcast and straight into the issues. To me, answering this question almost sounds like a sort of one is a laboratory concept, and then there is the real world. Of course, the Union never tried to develop strategic autonomy in a lab context, but because of the absolute urgency of feeling that the world was getting a place where the hope that EU and member states sort of interests were reflected just by the setup and the way that global institutions work, this has been sort of contested over the years. So, as you say, it's not an old concept, but what is new in the reality that we see at the beginning of 2025 and have seen emerging is that this all has to happen against very serious and existential threats. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine being the most pressing one. And so here Europeans feel their vulnerability, a lack of strategic autonomy most urgently because of what is happening on the other side of the Atlantic. And the president coming back to the White House suggesting that, of course, Europeans, which we would sign up to, need to take more responsibility into their hands, but also being someone who is a lot more unpredictable. So in that context, strategic autonomy is one where Europeans probably for the first time in many decades, and if you want to look at this from the sort of early 1990s perspective, the end of the confrontation, the fall of the Iron Curtain, etc., which is sort of the time that spans my career as someone who has been thinking about those issues. There you see for the first time that the European Union has to achieve this with an at times openly malign actor in Washington. And so this raises the stakes significantly. You can go through other areas where the Union wanted to be more autonomous and is working on. That includes also, of course, economic security, our trade relationships. On all those fronts, you can see that the level of difficulty at the beginning of 2025 is actually higher than it has been for quite some time. And so this poses a great deal of challenges, the most pressing one being, of course, Russia's war in the heart of Europe. But we see that the global environment is rapidly changing and not to the favor of the European Union and its members.
I mean, I think the benign reading would be that the European Union has always, or at least so far always, met the challenge when, the external environment required domestic adjustments and a further development of European integration. But at the same time, if you look at the unity amongst member states, for instance, and the general shape of the European Union, you could be forgiven for thinking that, this time actually might be different, that the obstacles are a bit too high to overcome, at least in the very near future. So what would be, in your view, the top priorities in terms of policy? Where do you start? I mean, an obvious topic that is already being forced upon the European Union by President Trump is obviously defense spending, right? So the 2% target is now being pushed towards 5%, that obviously not even the United States adheres to. So some might argue that this is a target that is unachievable, and it's designed to be failed, to set up a different direction for other policies. So in your view, what are the priorities? How do we get moving into the right direction? And how would you bring this about?
Yeah, let me just say a word about really the important question of the we. that you raised, looking at the European Union and member states, what I conclude is that the we in European collaboration has become a challenge in itself, because internally the Union is divided to an extent that we haven't seen so far, with probably a whole number of governments, including one that is being shaped in Vienna right now, will look with sort of in a more favorable manner at the ideas how to run countries and how to conduct policies and future of democracy and institutions of liberal democracy. On the other side of the pond, while of course liberal Europe is very much convinced that in its DNA, the European Union as a player that can actually have a role in this and in its supranationalized way. This is a concept that has gotten contested, of course, within the European Union, and it has an impact on foreign and security policy, a very tangible one, of course, when it comes to questions of how to continue supporting Ukraine, for instance. And so what we will see with a growing number of countries that have gone to the extreme margins of the right and also nationalist, often anti-European Union, that EU policy making, of course, has to respond to that. Shaping consensus in a union of 27 has gotten almost impossible. And I think we're at the point where there need to be sort of strategic consequences of that. I think we're going to talk about that. But what you're saying in terms of priorities, I mean, from my vantage point, as someone who has studied the union in more benign times, where, of course, the development of the single market was the most important issue to preserve prosperity for European citizens and create prosperity for European citizens. Now, security and defense are the absolutely existential questions. Without European security, there is no good future for Europe. And so the Union has been, of course, not a majorly important player when it comes to European security, because that is in the realm of the member states. The power lies with the member states. NATO is and continues to be the framework in which European nations engage to that end. But there are fundamental questions. You talk about the contributions on security and defense. We have to go further. I mean, what incoming President Donald Trump has put forward in terms of, shifting his eyes on Greenland and arguing for the U.S. needs to kind of. I struggle to find words with this because it's so different to the languages that we've heard in the past. So these are very fundamental shifts because, again, the European Union and its members are very vulnerable because they're not well equipped. They can no longer rely to the extent that they have to and had to U.S. being a stable partner in the alliance. And yet, of course, there is also a level of contestation within and between EU member states about contributions to security and defense. Needless to say, if you're sitting in Warsaw or in Vilnius or, in geographic proximity, there you feel this much more because your societies also, give that urgency to you. People and whole countries feel affected by that. But then in other parts of the Union, this probably doesn't look that urgent. So to create that urgency beyond even what we're hoping for in 2025, and that is a hope for Ukraine having a good future in peace and integrity and sovereignty, that is something that the Union will have to invest in. And what is interesting at this point in time, that for the first time, the European Union is, I think, very concrete and on a good path to develop in the mosaic of NATO responsibilities and the European pillar within NATO, member states' contributions, and sort of a role for the European Union with limited competencies to come up with a mosaic and a meaningful entry of EU policies. And that will be carried out by the new Commissioner for Defense, Andris Kubilius, who is very soon delivering a white paper on defense in which he will first and foremost, politically plot out how the Commission, with its single market sort of cloud, can help Europeans deliver on their commitments within NATO. So this is new and this is serious. And I think von der Leyen and her team are well placed to work on this. And this will be the absolute priority in the coming months and years. And then I just quickly, because time is limited and we can always give a deep dive. Of course, there is a whole number of other areas that the union has to do at the same time. So you can't really talk about sort of short-term, immediate, medium, and long-term, because the challenge is that all these things need to be happening at the same time in a way. And of course, that includes economic security. There is looming trade wars. Luckily, the union is better equipped in this field because the single market in its external dimension is strong and has developed teeth over time. Of course, the union doesn't want anything that is a trade war, but it cannot escape it. And there, I think we are fortunate in that instruments are in place, but it will be a very competitive and very controversial and conflictual environment, not least in relations between the United States and China that will then have repercussions on Chinese-EU relations. You are more an expert on this area, but this question of, how to preserve economic security for the union and its citizens is absolutely sort of rolling alongside the security angle. And then, of course, in the sort of DNA of the European Union is a world that is essentially working like the union itself, based on multilateralism, the rule of law, just institutions that are strong enough to mitigate conflict, the WTO being a case in point. So EU foreign policy and member states' foreign policy will have a continued interest in investing in reform of multilateral institutions, but it's become pretty lonely. And here again, the US, President Trump has made it very clear that he despises the EU. He doesn't find any interest in working in reliable environments. It's a sort of the power of the power of the powerful, or the might of the powerful. And so here the union will really have to step up in trying to engage with partners in the world, and that it hasn't done so enough in the past on, reforming multilateralism and preserving institutions, and really find new friends. At this point in time, this is a very challenging environment. The union, liberal union, the EU style union that we've seen evolving since the 1990s is lonely. And it is happening all in a very contested environment, including in the union's neighborhood in the south, not only with regard to Russia / Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. So this is potentially a dangerous environment. So the list of priorities is long, and it has to all happen, I'm afraid, pretty much at the same time.
And interestingly, if we can now stick for a moment, on the question of the internal unity versus the external challenge, there is a new vector of attack, you might argue, that we now have a private actor, i.e. Elon Musk, who's sort of an external actor with a domestic agenda as well. We've seen in Europe, his dealings with the Italian government. We've seen only yesterday that he supported again the AfD in the German election campaign, the AfD being a party that advocates for the withdrawal of Germany from the European Union. So we have a new type of actor who's also got obviously a media platform at his disposal to create a lot of political havoc. You can also see that in the UK, what is happening there with his attacks on Keir Starmer, with the Financial Times actually publishing today that he's consulting people to potentially overthrow the government before the next election. So this is also a new type of threat. So if he were to set his sights to the European Union directly rather than indirectly via right-wing populist parties in certain member states, how would you assess could the European Union withstand such an attack? Or could he whip up a lot of discontent against the European Union as such as well? And we've seen in the UK in the Brexit process what kind of political results could come from this.
Yeah, this threat is real, Henning. I think you're right, and I mean, in parts, I'd like to say that, of course, the union has teeth in that, regulatory approach to tech, and it has shown that. But it is going to be very challenging because I wouldn't put it David Goliath, but this takes a lot of power to confront. But this is ultimately not what you're talking about. Your point goes much deeper, and that is the question whether the European Union that was built in the course of the 1990s, kind of leaving this idea of being an economic union that provides for a single market towards a union that is political and that is an supranational organization of its own kind, is a liberal idea. And this is absolutely threatened by the man you're describing, and also by a lot of political parties in the European Union that we've seen over the years no longer signing up to that. The dangerous thing is that they, by and large, decided to go through the system. And so for me, it almost feels like the risk of an internal takeover. And that means if we want to preserve, and I say this as someone representing also, of course, this idea of liberal Europe and the institution of the European Union, if I was to help preserving that, of course, it helps sometimes to be very, very clear in saying, ultimately, there are some that would envisage the European Union in the future to be an intergovernmental body. And then it would be very, very different to what it is today. If one wants to fight that, this is a political fight to be fought. Unfortunately, in the political debates we're seeing in member states, it's so much more difficult to argue the case for the European Union these days, even for the parties in the middle, in the center, in the democratic center. They have, by and large, abandoned that, at least in key member states. It's a number of member states where it's still happening and it's still kicking in strong, this idea of European collaboration. But I think that makes it even more vital at this point in time that the European Union visibly shows it makes a contribution to security and prosperity of citizens in Europe. If it fails, the Union will fail. I don't see a future for it. And so, and in this spirit, I also see the new Commissioner von der Leyen starting off. People that are working with her, Kaja Kallas and others, they see that urgency very clearly.
I think that's exactly the key point, and that's why I mentioned it. I mean, if you look at the economic case for European integration that was, as you rightly said, developed in the 90s, especially with single market development and so on and so forth, there was a clear and compelling case to protect the European Union against those threats, also these political threats that are presented also from these new actors. The added value proposition really is in the security and foreign policy field, because I think it's intuitively understandable for most European citizens that, in view of an aggressive Russia, this threat is much better confronted together in coalition rather than, on their own. I think the value proposition here is easy to explain, and that's why I think that's the key lever. It's really the key lever to try to, shore up the support for the European Union as an institution as such, against the backdrop of the security threats from Russia, but also against the backdrop of the political threats that are undermining the actual structure of the European Union that has been built over the decades. So, and that's why I think I completely agree with you. That's why I think the security and foreign policy area is such a critical part. Yes, the economic agenda is important, but we've come a long way in this area, right? So there might be trade wars, but as you rightly say, the tools are in place. This is a very developed area, right? So that's an area that is very well developed. You need more dimensions. The social dimension is still underdeveloped, but there's a lot of development has already happened there. In the foreign and security policy area, there was a paradigm shift, right? The whole foundation has changed in recent years, and the European approach has not been updated yet, and that's the challenge. But at the same time, as I tried to explain, probably also the opportunity, in order to rebuild support for the European Union, as the economic argument has lost traction. I mean, as you know, that's to an extent back to the roots, right? The original proposition was, never again war on the European continent. We have again a war on the European continent, but that's an external threat, not an internal one, right? So that's why maybe that area provides the opportunity for a rejuvenation of this European idea.
Well, I'm going to be a pragmatic person now, and I don't want to sound anti-EU European, but nobody thinks I am because of the work I've done over many, actually, growing number of decades now, being a committed European. I think
you're not suspicious.
Really, yeah. Thank you for confirming, because for me it is important to see what we're confronting. We need to really understand that, as you suggest, it goes to the very core of, is there a future of a European Union that is able to provide for prosperity, or is there no future? And that is decided along the security angle that you're describing. And so even if you don't like the European Union because you think, the way it works is not quite, appealing, or it's too slow or whatnot, the dignity of this endeavor, of course, is very clear. But it is not only the dignity; it's an urgency in terms of delivering what is vital to the European continent. We are losing out, and if we don't have a union helping member states collectively leverage, then countries and societies will be worse off very, very fast. And my concern is just that. With the interpretation in the European elections being that the center held, that there is the fringes were basically pushed to the side, and there is a mandate now in the middle of the road, sort of part of the parliament for the Commission. With this narrative gaining ground in Brussels, we oversee the malign activities that are coming via member states. And this is something that the Union will not be able to digest and absorb for very much longer, because the growing number of governments that have gone completely different directions, including on EU policies, is just very, very much a reason for concern. And so this is why I really want to also sound a bit too alarmist. It's always difficult to say the Union is going to fail. If it fails, it would be disastrous, and the likelihood of it failing has grown.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's in a very similar situation as many national governments who are trying to fend off the populist threat domestically. The government need to be able to deliver, right? So they need to be able to deliver on the problems of people that they're actually facing. And on the European Union side, that's clearly the problem of security, and it needs to prove that it's capable of delivering this, and it's the right institution to deliver that. If the delivery of these requirements fails, then it becomes very, very difficult to lead the argument. And I completely agree. I mean, the European election was one election at one point in 2024, right? So we've seen since how the national elections, who all have, by definition, repercussions on the European scene, how they have went, right? So, and we have another one coming at the end of February, and let's see how they go. I mean, as it stands, the right-wing populists are also set to gain a lot of votes in Germany, right? So, not to speak about political problems in France and elsewhere, right? So, I think your analysis is really spot on. It's becoming more and more difficult to deliver, but yet delivery is one of the key benchmarks against which the European Union has to perform. Otherwise, it's very hard to lead the argument.
And that is why the mode has to change. And I think we're going to get there. I mean, the idea of groups of member states going ahead, if no consensus can be found, is an old one. It was also a bit of a lab discussion, if you remember the days of the Schäuble, Lames, lots of ideas out there.
Good old enhanced cooperation.
Yes, exactly. Lots of nuance legally and, sort of political scientists putting forward X, Y, Z, and some tests, of course, of it happening. The political environment in the days was often to say, if we are differentiating too much, then, we're going to lose an eye on the cohesion of the overall thing. And I was supporting such an analysis in the past, but this has changed over the past years. I am a strong advocate, and I've done so alongside with colleagues just before the summer to say we need to revisit this. My political assessment is the Union needs groups of willing member states to move ahead now. Luckily, we have a responsible European in charge of the presidency at EU level as of 1st of Jan, that is Donald Tusk. Who knows very well the EU environment, which is absolutely an asset at this point in time. He cares about European security deeply because he cares about the security of his own country. He knows what it means to build coalitions, and he understands also what it takes to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. No, how do you call that? To do not only talk, but do what you're actually saying. And so I find it interesting that he's starting to assemble Nordic countries, that he is starting sort of to build coalitions and explore. I see also with a degree of openness to think about not doing this completely separate of the EU, which of course would be a risk. And I think we need to conceptually understand that it is always important to keep in mind that overall cohesion of the Union needs to be the ultimate goal. And to achieve that is always easier than to start building some coalition as part of a little bit of an EU mimicry almost, to make sure that the institutions are involved, because then, it is a lot easier to place it in a wider context of the EU 27 when time allows for that. And Tusk, I believe, is also open to discussing ideas of financing security and defense through ways that the Union has explored as part of Next Generation EU. I think we both remember the absolutely out of, almost in a frenzy discussion in Germany during the sovereign debt crisis and the so-called Euro bonds and the sort of up in arms of the political discussion elsewhere as well in Europe. I think we've moved on from that. Next Generation EU was a case in point as a response to the challenge that COVID posed. And any mechanism that would allow a group of member states not only talk about getting serious on security and defense as a contribution to Europe's pillar in NATO, but actually do that, including through a financing mechanism, that would be absolutely the right path right now. And I have to say, I have strong hopes, but also expectations with regard to Polish leadership here. There's an opportunity, and it will be a relevant space to watch in the coming weeks.
And interesting, we talked about how do we proceed. So enhanced cooperation, leadership by the presidency country with a leader who's actually had a lot of European experience. But if you come back to the what kind of policies are you alluded to the white paper being in preparation? But if you were writing the white paper, sort of what kind of policy priorities would you like to see being put forward as the top priorities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was particularly thinking of Donald Tusk as one who would be a very good leader to lead on a coalition of the willing in security and defense. To say here we are at this point in time with all we discussed earlier in the podcast, we need a significant step and beefing up of European commitments, including financial commitments to strengthening European capabilities, and that cannot be done individually. It requires a lot of weight also in financial terms, and we do that through a mechanism that we anchor within the broader sort of European Union environment, but we start that off with a group of willing member states to come along with that. That could possibly also include third countries. Speaking of relevant security actors in Europe, of course, the United Kingdom comes to mind first. Norway has a strong interest in being involved. So this is where I think the pressure is the most urgent one. And here, the white paper that Andris Kubilius is preparing in the first 100 days, so very, very soon, I think these are questions that will be looked at in a very practical way. And then, of course, it's about building political ownership. And that is not an easy one, including in key member states where there has been hesitation on any mechanisms on joint borrowing for a long time. But here's a case in point for strong leadership. The how is also about a rapid learning curve that conflict is going to be both within the EU and also in relations of the European Union, including with key partners such as the United States, is the new normal. And the Union is not so well prepared for conflict, partly because it learned to engage in an environment that was less conflictual and is set up in that logic, and partly because of the nature of this union, of being a union of member states, and these things of agreeing, consensus, etc., they need time. So the pace needs to completely change. And my sense is that important personalities at the top of EU institutions have understood that. I interpret the latest meetings on security and defense, exchanges on preserving European competitiveness. We have there also important reports by Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta. This is all there, but the pace needs to change in terms of how the union moves, how it takes decisions. And I think also we need an approach that is a lot riskier when it comes to groups of member states moving ahead. This can end in a completely different European Union. I am very much aware of that, but I don't see many alternatives at this point in time. So the way that the union has been operating as a consensus machinery has come really to its end. The aim should always be to have consensus between 27, but I don't think this is the right mode in this environment anymore. Whatever it takes to preserve security and to preserve prosperity for the future. And we haven't even talked about, all that strengthening competitiveness, investment in tech, et cetera, requires, we're very far away from where we should be as Europeans. This requires a different working mode at EU level.
I mean, you mentioned two important points. I mean, first of all, it is also about, working together with external allies, and especially the United Kingdom comes to mind when it comes to military might. But that raises also the question, for instance, how do you do maybe joint military procurement? How do you do kind of division of labor between different forces so you become more effective? I mean, I completely agree that there is a need for more spending and also more financial instruments to bring about that kind of these financial resources on a sustainable basis. But at the same time, the effectiveness of that spending needs to be addressed at the very same time. So, and obviously, it's going to be very important how Germany positions itself, how the new German government positions itself towards joint debt instruments and so on and so forth. But where's that scope, especially in relations to the UK and maybe also Norway that you mentioned, to improve the kind of political machinery in terms of division of labor, in terms of joint procurement, in terms of I don't want to call it value for money in this context, but more effective spending in order to, so we are in a position to build up capacity reasonably quickly?
It's an absolutely vital question, and should be a key priority for EU leaders in 2025 to find a good way to keep the United Kingdom engaged in a meaningful way, and to understand also the limitations that London still has in engaging on things European, especially in things EU European. But I think what makes it easier right now on security and defense is that Prime Minister Starmer doesn't have to work against the public in this area as much as he would always have to work on an EU debate angle, because security and defense in a kind of intuition in Britain is seen as something that is about us. and not them. So I believe, and I haven't seen sort of polls lately, but you can make the case with your electorates that, of course, the United Kingdom cares deeply about the future of Ukraine and cares about continental European security because it's a joint space of security. So that is actually good news. It would be a lot more difficult if we envisage a difficult and challenging domestic environment on Prime Minister Starmer on this point. But then, of course, the breathing space that he created by saying we're not going to re-enter the union at any point in time during my lifetime, that gave him breathing space to sort of move. But that breathing space is not immense. It is still something to navigate very carefully. And of course, also from the point of view of the European Union, it is more difficult to argue that, yes, the UK wanted Brexit and now we have Brexit and now we're crafting something that is about certain participation in single market. You're talking defense procurement, etc. That, then loosens that up a bit again. This is politically very sensitive. I think technically it can be done. And I would argue for trying to actually embrace this in a way that, politically it can also be navigated. And I guess the sense of urgency on security and defense plays a role here. But we know there is a lot more than just political opposition at times, to moving on because there's big corporate interest, business interest in the field of defense. And if the Union, alongside with NATO, managed to kind of make the business case in a Europeanized way, then I think we can move, including on a new relationship with the United Kingdom. And 2025 will be a very big opportunity to achieve that. So I am more optimistic, having followed the rapprochement over the past months in terms of, pictures and visits, all of that. And now the challenging thing would be to see what does that look like in detail. And I would hope for an environment where the European institutions, while not being naive, would have overcome, if there was ever such a thing as a kind of, feeling of being still a bit upset about the UK turning its back on the EU. This will be a very important piece to get right in 2025 and 2026.
You mentioned an interesting point. I mean, one of the sort of economic policy instruments you could use is you could obviously set incentives for companies in the relevant industry sectors to cooperate. I mean, you saw after the signing of the German-British treaty recently that alongside an investment of Rheinmetall in the UK was announced. So there are obviously political instruments with which you could incentivize corporate cooperation in the armament industry. So, and that would be maybe a non-conflictual and a politically less conflict-laden policy instrument to try to bring about a closer ties, right? So, not sure whether that has been explored yet in more detail, but that's definitely an area where I would think that maybe a joint program or something like that, where certain incentives are being brought into the program design for joint ventures, that could be one way to be pursued.
Well, for think tankers to lobby, at least those that believe in a good future for EU-UK relations, to be sort of put on the list of points to try and convince those that take decisions on that. But I think fundamentally you're also describing, this is an environment where I believe the logic should be whatever is needed to strengthen European security. So be it either through bilateral arrangements, such as the one between London and Berlin lately, and there are other examples of that. And in sort of more EU-UK environment and other third countries, Norway as a case in point, this is all welcome and should be looked at not from with a dose of ideology, but with, in that sense, a dose of pragmatism, if that is sort of the right word.
Absolutely, we need to deliver the results, right? So as the old, you mustn't be too bureaucratic about these things, right? So as the old saying goes, they're fiddling while Rome is burning. They might not be knowing that they're fiddling, and they might not be knowing that Rome is burning. But the situation is such that we just need to deliver results, and that's the key thing. So and if that means trying new things, leaving the trodden paths, so be it. So it's a time to deliver, not a time to tinker.
Yeah, there is no such thing as a trodden path anymore. And the latest wake-up call really is development in transatlantic relations. There have been enough signs on the wall in other parts of the world that Europe needs to get its act together. The time is now. I know we say that many, many times, and you always think, how can I escalate it even further to create the urgency? But I think it becomes pretty clear when it comes to the sort of the territorial sovereignty and integrity of the European Union and its member states and its neighboring countries, obviously Ukraine being the most important country in this regard right now. So this is the spirit in which I would expect the European Union's institutions to engage. It has taken a long time to put together the team, which is not the fault of von der Leyen. I think we have to acknowledge that. The treaties suggest this is the way forward. You have to shop around and put your cabinet together with what you can get from respective capitals, and then it takes a while until you have the team together. But I think at the top, it's in good shape. The right questions are being asked, where instruments are in place, as we discussed, we can be a little bit more optimistic. And there's a lot of work to do in the area of security and defense and so the broader foreign policy, because ultimately, I guess 2025 will also show with Russia's war of aggression, the old European security order is no longer. And Europe, absolutely. And with that, I mean EU, Europe, but also those partners that are still committed to the European way. We need to be at the table when it is negotiated what the future will look like. And I say this as someone who is at times a bit concerned that the European Union will actually be at all those relevant tables. They have to earn the attention again, including with our key partners across the pond. And best to do that is to start work at home. And so as an endless optimist on things European, we'll see a different mode. We'll see a different union evolving this year. But I think we also have a tremendous amount of resources, political and others, to make it happen. At least we cannot be defeatist and not try, I guess. And so hopefully as a think tank, we and others, we can play a role in identifying options and trying to understand better what is also politically possible in this current environment.
Well, those were very good closing remarks, Almut, and we are already well beyond the 30 minutes we initially wanted to talk. Thank you very much again for joining me on this episode of Social Europe Podcast. And I hope we can catch up again soon. And by that time, we hopefully can diagnose that a lot of the things that we talked about today have already been put in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henning. Great sharing a sofa with you, at least virtually.
This is Social Europe Podcast. We are dedicated to strengthening democracy by discussing the most pressing political, economic, and social issues of our time. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.